Escape from Giant's Crown. Chapter 5. Broken Things. Mao awoke to the roar of thunder. He opened his eyes slowly, but all that he could make out were the blurry forms of rotted wood planks converging into a pointed ceiling. Splashes of rainwater collected near his face. When he turned his head, he could see that there were a great number of them pouring like faucets down through the decrepit roof of the candle-lit attic. When he sat up and reached to wipe the sleep from his eyes, he felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder. It was a piercing pain, the kind that made him wonder if he would ever be the same again. He fell flat abruptly, his veins pulsing to the rhythm of his accelerated heartbeat. He ran his fingers from his other hand over the outside of the bandages in the shoulder along the stitching lines where the flesh had been sealed back together. The surface was misshapen, disrupted. The stitches were hard against the tender flesh underneath the bandage. He felt numb on the surface, but it still stung all the way through his chest, under the skin where the muscles had been severed. He wondered if it would ever heal entirely, or if it would leave a horrible scar. He let out a sigh of relief. At least he was still alive. The pain would be a reminder of this, but one that made him grateful. Lying there for a moment, he tried to move the fingers on his left hand, gauging the point at which the pain would make him stop. Slowly at first, and gradually more. He moved his wrist and hand, cautious not to overextend and cause more damage. But when he tried to elevate his arm from the shoulder again, he winced with the hot flash of pain and steadied it back into a comfortable place. He'd seen the meat under his flesh when it was an open hole, gnawed and mangled by the Beast of Tuksa. Each time he touched the bandages, he remembered the wretched scream of the wolf creature when he stabbed it through the heart with the bone-toothed blade that Oliff had given him. But Mao was alive. He had survived it, and that was enough. Was the monster really dead? Had he killed it? The memories came back in flashes. If he had killed the thing, he wasn't sure how to feel about it. The beast was most certainly responsible for the deaths of many people from Tuksa. He could still smell the stench of its victims on its breath when it dragged them into the woods. But still, his foe was a living thing, and he had taken its life. He thought of Oliff and how he couldn't imagine him ever killing another creature except for food or for fur in the middle of a harsh winter. Would Oliff be angry with him for what he'd done? In that moment, when he was stuck in the maw of the creature, he just reacted. Wasn't that the very reason his Earthfather had given him the blade? But to kill a living thing like that, beneath it all, he was frightened of what he might be capable of, even if it was for survival. His Tuksan neighbors had feared him for being different, for being a Moonken, and perhaps he was capable of becoming everything that they had feared him to be. The thought added a sudden weight to the back of his mind. He sunk back into the pillow. That's where he would keep those fears. He resolved not to dwell on the trouble any longer. For now, other concerns demanded his attention. Now where am I? He sat up from his ragged blanket to get his bearing. Next to his makeshift bed sat a pile of medical bandages and a small candle that illuminated the room with a dim, warm light. The leaky old attic was small, with a low ceiling, and it smelled like a rotting swamp. It was a room full of broken things. Old luggage, an ancient clock, statues of what Mao assumed were gods and goddesses, torn rugs of multicolored fabric, smashed trinkets, splintered crates, and boxes of broken glass. The last thing he remembered was the elevator traveling up the leg of the stone giant, and the doorman mumbling something about peach pins. How long had he been out? Where was Bartol? Where was Oliff? Surely they hadn't been abandoned. Outside a rounded attic window, the rain came down in a torrent, drops drumming against the wooden roof. Rows of pointed multi-story buildings lined the drenched cobblestone road. Mao pushed his face up to the broken window for a better view. The street lamps glimmered, distorted by the haze of rainfall. He rubbed the glass, eagerly cleaning it with his good arm to see more, but it was far too dark. "What is this place?" he whispered, his eyes full of wonder. On the desk next to the candle sat several bottles with pills in them and a stack of papers. He'd hoped for some kind of note from Oliff, but from what he could discern, the papers weren't letters at all. He thumbed through them. Each one contained an outline of services or treatments, and a total amount due. Mao's heart sank. There was no way that Oliff had even seen 1,000 penny in his lifetime. He felt a sudden urge to find Oliff and Bartol and get out of there. He flung the blanket off and dashed for his clothes, keeping his arm tucked at his side. It was awkward to maneuver his shirt and pants with one arm bandaged and slung to his chest, so after a few failed attempts, he simply wrapped the blanket over his head and around his arm and sauntered out, his bare feet slapping down the stairs. The stairwell was 3 stories tall and snaked around the entire building, taking him to the outside rail overlooking the shoulder of the giant. From there, Mao could see much more of the stone colossus which reached its arms out into the distant rain clouds, suspending a tree in its palms over the buildings. Rows and rows of pointed homes wrapped around the giant's head, assuming the shape of a crown, interwoven with an intricate system of metal rails and electric lanterns. He dreamt of this place, from the stories Oliff had told him and the glimpses that he'd caught in the elevator, but nothing had ever been so magnificent to behold as this. When he rushed out into the street, an approaching pair of lights nearly blinded him before swerving away off the roadway and crashing into a lamppost. The motorized 4-wheeled contraption hissed with smoke. "Oi! Watch where you're going, you runt!" coughed a voice from the motorized carriage. A white-bearded stranger in a long tattered coat stepped out of the clunky old box and began to inspect the damage. He wasn't as toothless or tattered as the old hobos at the toe, but he wasn't a wealthy man either. Most of his clothes were well layered and fit nicely, but were muddy and torn. Even his motor carriage was rusty and coughed smoke with every click and rattle. The stranger realized that more damage had been done to the post than to his carriage. But he was quite visibly upset and charged at Mao sternly. "Oi! Now is you going to pay for this, eh? I'd only just got me wheels polished." He pushed his finger into the boy's chest, shoving him back half a step. By now a few people had gathered around, which made him very uncomfortable. Mao dreaded having too much attention on him. His experience with crowds hadn't been ideal, and usually ended with an egg or old food splattered all over him. His feet itched, compelling him to run away, but he didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," he said, pulling his blanket around him tight. Nervously, he tried to twitch the blanket up to cover his ears, but it was too late. The stranger had already seen that he was not a normal boy. "Oi, you ain't one of them Moonken," the stranger said, eyeing him up and down. "Blimey." "I'm not really a..." Mao stumbled a bit over his words. He only knew what a Moonken was by name, but in Tuksa, the word might as well be a curse. They'd come so far, and that was a world that he wanted to leave behind. "I'm from Tuksa," he replied as if it were a casual thing, then awkwardly waited for a response. No, the Raggedy Man said. "You's a Moonken, all right. Look at them there ears and white hair and all of it. Oi, we got ourselves a Moonken here," he yelled to a gathering crowd. "Come on then, show us something kung fu-ish then. Like a woo or a wah." The stranger began to turn left and right, hands flat and outstretched, and mule kicked to the air, nearly throwing himself off balance. The growing crowd of men encircled him with agreeable yas and come on thens. They all wanted to see what a Moonken could do. In truth, Mao wanted to know too. He had no idea about kung fusios or whatever the stranger was talking about, but they were so excited by the idea that it made him want to know how to do some of that stuff. Instead, he just stood there, looking inquisitively at the stranger who still stood holding his arms out awkwardly like a bird, waiting for something. "Oi, look at this! A monk who knows nothing about being a monk!" The dirty man leaned in with a bit of a sinister expression. "What is you even doing here, kid? You lost or something?" Then turning to the crowd, he called out, "Anyone the guardian of this lost kid here, eh?" When no one made a reply, he looked down at Mao. "Lost, eh? Haven't got a home to go to? Or an uncle or a dad or something? Haven't got many kids round here, you know. Likely 'cause you types go around breaking up street lamps and whatnot. Methinks someone's gonna need to pay for it somehow, eh?" Mao didn't know what to say. "Haven't you got the penny to pay for this?" he inquired, while the crowd tightened. Mao stepped back until he felt the cold, wet stone wall press against him. I don't have any money," he answered nervously, raising his empty hands. The stranger grabbed him by the arm, twisting and squeezing his wound, causing him to cry out in pain. In an instant, seemingly from out of nowhere, Bartol leapt into the air, latching his jaws onto the stranger's sleeve, pulling his hands away from Mao. The man yelled, shaking the dog off of his coat. "What's all this? Someone get this mutt off of me!" He flailed about to free himself as Bartol growled louder. Bartol! Came a booming voice. "It's all right, let him go." Oliff came rushing in between the boy and the crowd, who immediately backed away from him. He gestured for everyone to calm down, but it was no use. He was much larger than any of the locals, and they were obviously intimidated by his size, enough that they all took several steps backward. His bowler hat and 4 golden peach pins were clear indicators that this man worked for Byron. And not a soul in Giant's Crown would stand against one of Byron's men, not in broad daylight anyway. "Oi, oi!" The crowd erupted into a low rumble and began to disperse. Everyone except for the motor carriage driver. "It's all right, everyone. Calm down now," Oliff repeated. When Bartol relaxed and moved to stand by Oliff's side, the driver flung out his arms again. "Is that your brat, then?" he demanded. "Owes me money and damages, he does. Just look at my motor carriage." "Look, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. We don't want any trouble. Just take this. It's all that I have." Oliff extended a handful of coins, which the man greedily snatched and eagerly began to count. "I trust that we're settled here?" Oliff asked as he straightened himself. For a moment the man calculated how much more he could guilt Oliff into offering. "Only so long as you keep that mutt and that brat away from me. There's a reason we ain't allowing no kids in Giant's Crown." He glowered at Mao. "You run into streets, you break things. There are them consequences and prices to pay." "What was that?" Oliff said through his gritted teeth. "I says," the man said and shoved Mao for emphasis, "you keep your little brat out of my way." Something inside Oliff snapped. His leg flew out from under him, kicking the headlight clean off of the motor carriage. It spun into the air almost in slow motion, colliding into the man's gut, knocking him over and onto his knees, gasping for air. Oliff proceeded to tackle the man backward onto the ground and pummeled his face relentlessly with his bare fists. Mao stepped back, astonished. "You know who the hell I work for?" Oliff yelled with a rage that Mao had never seen. The sight of Oliff beating this man in the streets stunned him so hard that he began to cry. "Stop! Please stop!" Mao whimpered. Bartol barked, pulling at Oliff's clothes. But Oliff's mind was fixated and full of rage. This wasn't him. This wasn't who he wanted to be. It was who he had to be. It was what this place had made him. He wanted to tear down every inch of the city, brick by stinking brick. He wanted to smash through the face of every statue, kick through every headlight, and tear down every peach in Giant's Crown. He lost himself in a rage at all the things he couldn't change in the world. "Stop!" Mao screamed through streaming tears, and Oliff pulled away, panting. The man on the ground leaned his purpling face to the side and spit out several bloody teeth. Mao stared at Oliff in disbelief. He didn't know what to think. It was hard for him to imagine his Earth father as anything but perfect, honest, and kind. After all he'd seen in Tuksa and the Dark Forest, Oliff was the only thing that was right in the world. What did you do?" Mao pleaded. Oliff looked away, unable to meet the boy's tear-filled gaze.